No, I still hold my view in that sense because I think 10 days doesn't really change in terms of macro perspective. I do think that the global environment is gradually improving. And I think a lot of the rally that we've seen in India is really being fueled by the fact that we probably will see tapering only in 2014. So that it does create a bit of a gap, a bit of an opportunity for tactical trade position to be put on in terms of India. If we look at the macro environment, I think there's still a lot of uncertainties. Of course, I think some degree of political clarity is helpful, but I don't think things have changed all that much compared to 2 weeks ago. I think tapering is definitely not set in 2013 as we run out of time for this year. Whether it will take place in March in 2014, that remains to be seen because there's still a few hurdles. Number one, how the government shutdown in October is impacting on the economy, impacting on the job market. We will only really find out towards the end of this year and maybe in January of 2014. And then we can make a proper assessment. Number two, there's still another potential government shutdown looming over middle of January, and again the Fed is going to be wary of this potential problem. So I think in that sense the earliest we could see tapering being announced is March, but there's always the possibility that this could be postponed later in the year, even though my personal view is that the Fed really should start to taper and as soon as they can. But in terms of what they should do and what they will do is clearly very different. What they should do is do it now, but then what they will do is probably, well, March the earliest. Well, I think it will continue for some time, and typically you do see the fourth quarter of the year being a very constructive quarter for equities on a seasonal basis. So I think this party could continue for some time, and hopefully that could actually trigger some upside in terms of local spending, a local investment. But I think at the moment I do expect the risk-on sentiment to continue for at least another 2 or 3 months. And also the fact is, when tapering comes, we will see we're very likely to see some knee-jerk reaction in the equity markets, but overall the bottom line is that the Fed will only taper when the US economy is in better shape, and that eventually will cheer the market despite the knee-jerk reaction. Well, I think once the tapering discussions clears out, I think I agree with you. But when the tapering discussion is being brought back to the fore at the moment, I think market, while they have not eliminated the possibility of tapering, they've certainly delayed the expectation of tapering. So in that sense, I think a lot of the investment dollars right now, they're not necessarily positioning for long term, they're positioning for the short term. So between now and whenever the Fed restart the whole tapering discussion, I think the market will be in a pretty bullish mode. But when tapering discussion comes back to the fore, I think the market will still react in a similar fashion to what we saw back in the summer, albeit I don't necessarily believe it will be the same magnitude, but nonetheless I think the risk-off sell-off could well still come when the Fed brings back the whole tapering discussion. Well, I think absolutely. I think if you look, I'm looking at 12 to 18 months, possibly longer investment horizon. I do think as the world gets better, notwithstanding the volatility during the tapering discussion, I do think that cyclicals are likely to perform well. At the same time, I think Indian investors should also look overseas, because we have seen markets like the US, like Europe, like Japan, which have performed pretty well in 2013, and I do think that their outlook remains constructive. So obviously, we're always fighting against a very high yield in fixed income in India, but nonetheless, I think investors really ought to look at diversification, because my view is that the potential upside for fixed income is likely to be more limited going forward. But at the same time, it's going to be a much more a market driven by equities, or a portfolio return driven by equities, not only for Indian investors, but also for global investors.